HarperCollins presents Uncommon Ground, written and read by Patrick Galbraith. For EMB, CMB Senior, and particularly for John Smelt. Introduction. Hard-earned ground. I can't remember how I first met Paul and Dave Upton, but it must be over a decade since they first took me out at dawn onto the mud to where the Ouse meets the Trent and the Humber. As boys in the 1950s, the two brothers wanted to join the cod fleet, but their mother wouldn't allow it on account of all the Hull trawlermen who had drowned at sea. When Paul and Dave left school, they got jobs in the shipyard, and like lots of working men on the East Coast, they spent all the spare time they had out on the mud in the half-light shooting geese for the pot. One February morning, a couple of years back, just before dawn, Paul and I were hunkered down on the mud beneath a rowan tree. Somewhere out in the estuary, a redshank cried, ducks whistled high in the blackness, and to the west you could hear the low rumble of the Humber Bridge. As we sat there, sharing a flask of tea, Paul told me that the mud we were sitting on is contested ground. Down the decades, men like Paul and Dave have fought to preserve what they see as their right to go wildfowling. There are people in the Humber Wildfowlers Club, Paul said, who don't have much else. Membership isn't expensive, and for them, the pinks returning in autumn after spending the summer on their breeding grounds in Svalbard is an almost spiritual thing. When the Wildfowlers Association of Great Britain and Ireland was founded by a railway worker called Stanley Duncan in a since washed-away hut in 1908, his concerns were drainage and the rich. Duncan recognised that areas like the Humber estuary were being claimed for agriculture, which resulted in less habitat for birds, and he was also troubled by the prospect of wealthy sporting tourists buying up and renting land that had long been shot over by local people. Paul and Dave's latest worry, over a century on, is that the marsh will have to be sacrificed when the river rises. After all, mitigating flooding in Hull must take precedence over the preservation of the dark mud and reed beds. After retracing our steps through the reeds, we drove to a bakery to buy breakfast. Then we sat at a bus stop outside an old Methodist chapel to eat our pies. As we ate, Paul told me that if I had time, he'd show me Stanley Duncan's grave. When the old wildfowler died, there hadn't been money for a headstone, but years later the Uptons worked out, using parish records, where it was he was buried, and local wildfowlers had a whip round on account of what Stanley had done for them. There was a cold northerly blowing through the firs, and we stood for a while next to the grave with the traffic on the road behind us running into Hull, backing up at a set of temporary traffic lights. At the top of the headstone there was a carved goose, and the words "not for one, but for all" had been inscribed beneath it. That was, Paul explained, the way Stanley saw the land. Every year in autumn, when the geese return from the north, Paul and his brother collect feathers from the mud and leave them at the grave. "I'm not religious," Paul said, with a shrug, "but sometimes I'll scatter a bit of gunpowder, too." Paul might not be a man of any sort of traditional faith, but it's clear that he has a profound, almost pagan connection with the land. The marsh for him is a sacred place, and the goose is his totem. That morning on the Humber confirmed to me that for some people, to lose access isn't a trivial thing. It's truly existential. It was also a reminder of how extensive and varied the battle for access is in Britain. Currently, the fight for land access makes the news regularly, but it is almost always about campaigning on Dartmoor or some MP calling, usually without having much of an understanding of the subject, for a new Right to Roam Act. Often, the most interesting access battles going on are completely overlooked. All the same, there is a narrative that access to the countryside in England and Wales is as bad as it's ever been, and it's often said that landowners and politicians are intentionally trying to exclude us. Once upon a time, the story goes, we were all free men who farmed the fields together and lived sustainably, whereas currently, it's claimed most weeks, we are only able to access 8% of the countryside. This is simply untrue.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?